If Landorus-Therian is so good in every generation it's been in, then why isn't it banned from OU?
I come from the Gen 4 and 5 days where if something had in the ballpark of 30% usage, that it was like, whoa, that's a lot. Scizor was our Lando-T, and it hovered around the 30% mark for a long time. People are like, oh man, Scizor is everywhere. I'm so sick of seeing it. So this is funny because in Gen 7, there was this period, early Ultra Sun and Moon, where Lando-T's usage was just ridiculous. Lando-T was over 70% usage at one point, and nobody batted an eye. They were just like, oh yeah, it's Lando. But you would have that regular exchange where two Landos would just face off and stealth rock and then HP ice and then switch out. And everyone knows what Lando does. It checks pretty much everything with some of the best defensive typing in the metagame alongside Intimidate. It's not passive, even though it's defensive. And it's also a huge offensive threat if you want, but it's so spammable because it's so easy to cover so much with it in just one slot. And team building in Pokemon is hard. You want to be able to check things. And a lot of the threats in OU that Lando-T is tasked with taking on are not easily handled. They don't have a lot of good answers. That's why they're OU. And that's why Lando-T gets used so much, to slow down that Garchomp or that Terrakion. But it's not necessarily hard countering things, it's just helping you play around things. That's why people like it. It has the rigidity of, let's say, a Blissey, which you just throw into every special attacker forever. Lando-T is a defensive Pokemon that helps you play around things and set up your own offense because it also has such playmaking capabilities like U-turn and knockoff. And so it generates your own offense while playing defense, which you really like to have. So you're not just being passive, let's say a Blissey might be. And so it's super spammable, and you don't really mind that kind of presence in a metagame when it's not overbearing. Because for Lando-T to be banned, which there have been a few people, in fairness, who have been saying, okay, maybe Lando-T is it's not that Lando-T is ban-worthy necessarily, but its high usage does make you raise an eyebrow. Say, okay, why do we need Lando-T to cover so much? In almost a GSE Snorlax style fashion.
Like the reasoning for banning it would be more that it feels like a team requirement.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not generally some sign of a healthy tier where you need this Pokemon or you are so much worse off for not using it that it's not a healthy presence in the metagame, because you're saying, okay, what is wrong with the metagame that you need this one Pokemon to hold it all together? That's symptomatic of a greater issue. And in a Snorlax scenario, the reason why that doesn't get banned is because it's a very old metagame with a very limited player base. But Lando-T, it's always been very current, huge player bases, each generation bigger than the last as it gets used more and more. So why not? And I think the reason why Lando-T has never seriously been considered for a ban is that it's a couple of reasons. First of all, it's not overbearing in any aspect. Not to say it's not a huge threat, of course. In fact, sometimes people forget that it has an attack stat comparable to Groudon, and alongside Stab Earthquake, and a terrific offensive move pool. But that's because it's so good defensively. But it's not broken offensively. No one could argue that. So it would have to be broken with utility or defense. And when you think of the Pokemon that are in Ubers because of their defensive capabilities, like Pokemon with low attacking stats but just off the charts bulk, you think of things like Lugia and Giratina. Not to say that I don't want to set a bad precedent, because not every Uber Pokemon needs to be on the level of Kyogre, for example, to be Uber. That has nothing to do with it. But I mentioned that to more illustrate the idea of, if you're going to be overwhelming defensively, you need to be ridiculously bulky. It's very rare that a Pokemon gets banned for being too good defensively. Matter of fact, sometimes people say, hey, Lugia wouldn't be that bad in OU because it doesn't hurt anything. And that's not a good argument, but that's the kind of thing you're dealing with. So with Lando-T, it is nowhere near overwhelming defensively, specifically because of what was just mentioned. It's never going to wall an entire team by itself. It has good longevity for sure. Spike's immunity is fantastic, but it doesn't have any recovery of its own. Once in a blue moon, you'll see Protect Landorus from some player really trying to squeeze every bit of recovery out of it, a la, let's say, Advanced Swampert hurt. But it's a tough move to fit. More physical version of Blissey would not even be Skarmory, not really. It would be Tangrowth, more like, because it has the stupendous physical bulk and regenerator and heals with Giga Drain and even things like Leech Seed. And the bulk is just titanic. So that's more comparable to Blissey, whereas Lando-T, it's not walling things throughout the game. It is taking hits and helping you generate your offense in return. But as the trade-off for helping you generate that offense, it is not going to be as good at taking hits repeatedly. And because it doesn't heal. And it's not easy to fit things like Wish on your team to support it. And so you don't use Lando-T as that kind of wall. It's not going to be too good defensively. And in terms of utility, it's a good utility Pokemon for sure, but the idea that it's completely irreplaceable is suspect once you really examine it. For example, in Oris, Lando-T used to be the most spammed thing ever, right? And then people started using Gliscor with nearly identical sets based on actually the way it was used in Gen 7, because Gliscor does a lot of things that Lando-T can't. Actually, the most comparable Pokemon to Lando-T, because it has identical typing, but it heals a lot more reliably between Poison Heal and Roost. Roost alone being a gigantic difference. It doesn't hit as hard, but it's much better purely in defensive terms, because Lando-T's utility is Intimidate, letting it check everything. You famously see Lando-T switching into things like Gyarados. It's weak to Waterfall, but I need to Intimidate it. But that's the way you use Lando-T, to pivot around everything from Gyarados to Mega Swampert to Mamoswine to Weavile. Gliscor can't do that, but Gliscor will take something like Garchomp Outrage over and over and over because it has the capacity to heal. I'll put it this way. More people have wanted to ban Gliscor in recent years than have wanted to ban Lando-T. Now, not to say that there has been a ban Gliscor movement or anything, but we've seen many generations where especially defensive Swords Dance Gliscor just manages to beat things you would think it has no business coming anywhere near beating. Things spamming HP Ice against it, and it just keeps roosting, and suddenly it's at +6 attack and destroying your entire team with Earthquake and Facade. And you're just like, how did it happen? And that is something that Lando-T could never, ever pull off. Yes, Lando-T can pull off sweeps, but that level of insane defensive utility, Gliscor is a Scald Absorber of all things, which is absolutely ridiculous. That status sponging, that hit taking repeatedly, that ability to have longevity in your boosting threat, that is a lot more of a, let's say in quotation marks, detrimental impact than anything Lando-T could do. The reason Lando-T isn't banned is that, yes, it's extremely slashable on any team. Like, the most obvious comparison is GSE Snorlax, but it's really not anywhere in that ballpark. It never oversteps any boundaries of brokenness. But when you complain about facing Lando-T, you more complain that you see it all the time and that you'd like a little variety. You don't complain that Lando-T beats everything. I guess if you want to use lower tier Pokemon and Lando-T destroys them, then that's something else. But that's just the nature of OU. If it wasn't Lando-T, it'd be something else like Ferrothorn or whatever. Maybe use more offensive Lando and remind people that it is a threat and not just a defensive pillar of teams, because that's the easy way out. That's why Lando-T is so spammed. It's easy to slap it on your team and cover pretty much the entire OU tier by default. But if you use it more as a threat, then first of all, you're going to surprise people because they're going to think that you're just a defensive Lando-T. And second of all, you will unlock not latent potential. It's not like offensive Lando is a secret, but you will be using a very underrated set that will give you an edge, because a lot of people are not prepared for Lando-T suddenly threatening them.